January 1945. The air over Luzon hung heavy with smoke, drifting in slow, trembling waves across a shattered hillside. Spent cartridges glittered among the mud like tiny fragments of a broken mirror. As the gunfire faded, an American Marine brushed dust from his face and noticed a small cloth pouch half buried under a fallen Japanese soldier. Inside were letters, creased, water-damaged, written in a careful hand. He could not read the kanji, but he recognized the tone instantly, a family trying to reach someone who would never return home. He folded the papers softly, almost reverently, before slipping them into his pack. Decades later, a different pair of hands, older, gentler, opened that same pouch under the warm light of an Oregon library. An archivist studied the letters, now fragile and yellowed with time. The names were still clear, the addresses still real. And suddenly, after so many years, the idea emerged that these messages from another lifetime could finally find their way back to the people they were written for. The journey of those lost letters begins long before their return, shaped by a war that tore families apart and scattered memories across distant islands. In the early 1940s, long before those letters were ever lifted from Pacific soil, the world had already begun sliding into a conflict that would redraw nations and break millions of lives. Japan had pushed deep into East Asia, building an empire through momentum, belief, and sacrifice. By the time the Pacific War erupted in 1941, every Japanese household understood that a husband, a father, a brother might be sent thousands of miles away to fight on islands they had never heard of. Letters became lifelines, small threads connecting a soldier's fragile present to the world he hoped to return to. Families waited weeks, sometimes months, for a single envelope bearing familiar handwriting. For many, it was the only proof that their sons were still alive. As Japan's armies advanced across the Pacific, the U.S. military found itself facing an opponent deeply shaped by ideas of duty, silence, and honor. Japanese soldiers carried small cloth bags or paper envelopes tucked close to their chests, messages from home, photographs, charms, sometimes just a child's scribble. These were not luxuries, they were emotional armor. Many also carried the official Senjinkan, the field service code that urged them never to surrender, reinforcing a mindset where defeat was worse than death. But alongside this rigid doctrine lived deeply personal emotions captured in the letters they cherished. A mother worrying about autumn harvests, a wife describing the children learning to walk, a parent urging their son to survive the impossible. By 1943 and 1944, the war's momentum had shifted. American forces were advancing island by island, and each step forward meant encountering abandoned camps, ruined bunkers, and bodies that would never be claimed. On Saipan, on Guam, on Tinian, Marines and soldiers often found small piles of personal effects left behind during chaotic retreats. Many did not know what these letters said, but the tenderness in their presentation, the careful folding, the pressed flowers, the small brushstroke characters, made clear they belonged to someone loved. In the haze and brutality of combat, these letters took on a strange dual life. For American servicemen, they were evidence of the humanity of an enemy often portrayed as faceless, fanatical, and unyielding. For some, they were painful reminders that the men they fought had families waiting for them too. Others kept them simply because they didn't want them lost forever in the mud and fire. And for a few, they became private burdens carried home in footlockers, wrapped in guilt or curiosity, never quite thrown away. The Pacific Islands themselves often became graves without markers. Heat, rain, insects, and bomb blasts destroyed countless documents, erasing final messages before they ever reached their destinations. Thousands of Japanese families assumed their sons' keepsakes were gone forever, swallowed by jungles, burned in naval gunfire, or buried beneath shifting sands. The war ended, but the silence remained. The missing stayed missing. The last words written by many soldiers never touched the fingers of the people they loved. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, a different silence settled across the nation. Widows and parents lined up before government offices seeking answers, often receiving only a date, a place, and a simple phrase, "Killed in action," no personal effects, no final note, no closure. In countless homes, a small space on the altar remained empty, waiting for something, anything, that could speak of a loved one's final moments. Yet unknown to those grieving families, thousands of letters had been carried across the Pacific, tucked into duffel bags and storage chests in the United States. Some servicemen forgot they had them. Others hid them, unsure whether they had the right to keep such personal things. A few felt a quiet responsibility but had no idea how to return them to a foreign nation they had once fought. The distance between a family in rural Japan and an attic in Ohio or California seemed impossibly large. And for many years, those letters slept, silent, yellowing reminders of a war that had taken far more than lives. But the end of the conflict marked only the beginning of the letter's long journey home, shaped by occupation, rebuilding, and the first small efforts to piece together what war had torn apart. In the months after Japan's surrender, the country entered an unfamiliar and unsettling chapter. The occupation forces under General Douglas MacArthur began reshaping political structures, rebuilding industries, and stabilizing a nation reduced to ashes. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya were silent ruins. Millions searched for relatives. Some returned from the front as shadows of the people they once were, others never returned at all. Families clung to whatever fragments remained: military papers, photographs, half-burned postcards, anything that offered a final link to those lost in distant seas and jungles. In this fragile environment, American soldiers stationed in Japan often brought with them the captured artifacts they had collected during the war. Yet in the early post-war years, the idea of returning such personal items was far from simple. Japan was wrestling with humiliation, defeat, and deep cultural wounds. The older generation viewed the loss as a stain on family honor. Speaking openly about dead relatives, especially those who fell in service to a wartime regime now discredited, was painful for many. Some preferred silence over revisiting the circumstances that had taken their sons away. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American veterans settled into civilian life with memories that refused to fade. Some of them had stored the letters in shoeboxes, wrapped in cloth or sealed in envelopes. The items were too intimate to throw away, yet too burdensome to display. A few veterans felt a quiet tug of responsibility, a sense that these papers were not theirs to keep. They wondered about the families who had written them and whether anyone still waited for answers that never came. But in the 1940s and 1950s, returning such items seemed nearly impossible. There were no established channels, no systems to trace names written in a foreign script, no diplomatic programs to bridge the gap. Japan's post-war government, overwhelmed by reconstruction and humanitarian crises, did not initially prioritize repatriating battlefield belongings. Instead, families filled local shrines with symbolic tablets representing soldiers whose remains had never been found. For many, grief settled into routine, becoming a quiet presence that accompanied daily life. The loss became something endured rather than spoken about. The past stayed in shadow. But attitudes began to shift in the 1960s and early 1970s. Japan had rebuilt its economy and regained a sense of stability. Younger generations started asking questions about the war, seeking stories and artifacts that connected them to history their parents rarely discussed. This period saw the first whisper of public interest in finding lost wartime letters, diaries, and photographs. American veterans, too, were aging. Some revisited their wartime experiences with new eyes. Others found that the letters they once kept for curiosity had gained emotional weight over time. These papers represented unfinished stories. The idea of sending them home, once unthinkable, slowly became a meaningful gesture. Informal attempts began. A veteran might approach a Japanese embassy. Another might send a letter to a newspaper in Tokyo. Occasionally, a small ceremony formed around the return of a single envelope to a grateful family, covered in tears and bows. Although these early efforts were scattered and unorganized, they signaled something deeper growing beneath the surface, a shared desire for closure. Word spread in Japan that some families had received personal effects from American soldiers decades after the war ended. Newspapers began reporting on these rare events. Each time, the public reacted with a mixture of disbelief and longing. If one letter could return home, perhaps thousands more were still out there. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, historians, volunteers, and veterans groups on both sides of the Pacific recognized the need for a more systematic approach. New organizations emerged. Local Japanese communities collected records of missing soldiers, while American groups began identifying artifacts stored in private collections. A movement slowly took shape, one focused not on politics, not on rewriting history, but on honoring individual lives lost to the tides of war. Families who had spent decades resigned to silence suddenly had hope. Veterans who had carried emotional burdens found a way to lay them down. And the scattered letters asleep in attics and drawers were finally preparing to make their journey home. For the families of Japanese soldiers, a letter was more than paper. It was a heartbeat traveling across oceans. Many soldiers wrote with a calm tone, carefully choosing words that shielded their families from worry. They spoke of good health even when malaria racked their bodies, mentioned clear skies even when artillery thundered through the night. These letters often carried small glimpses of daily life, requests for pickled plums, updates about siblings, reminders to tend to family shrines. At the front, the act of writing created a momentary escape from the harsh reality around them. Many men folded the pages slowly, almost ceremonially, knowing it might be the final message they ever sent. For their families, the arrival of each envelope was a moment of relief and gratitude. The absence of letters, on the other hand, cast a heavy silence over entire households. Every knock at the door, every telegram delivery in the neighborhood triggered dread. In that era, a letter was the closest thing to a soldier's voice, and when those voices suddenly stopped, families clung to whatever remained, often nothing at all. On the American side, the discovery of these letters brought complicated emotions. Wartime training had conditioned U.S. troops to view the Japanese soldier as relentless and fanatical, but encountering personal belongings created a sudden shift. A diary entry about missing home, a father's message to his children, or a photograph of a smiling young couple, these glimpses of humanity pierced through the image of an enemy defined only by conflict. Some Marines and soldiers kept letters as reminders that the war's brutality had consumed men just like themselves, young, frightened, hopping to survive. Others felt guilt not because they had taken the items, but because returning them was impossible during the chaos of battle. There were also practical reasons. Mail systems were overwhelmed and no one knew how long the war would last. What began as a moment of curiosity eventually grew into a burden that many carried for decades. The letters represented a connection that neither side had asked for but one that neither could forget. Archivists and historians later recognized the profound importance of these forgotten papers. Many items carried dates, names, and military units that could help identify soldiers who had vanished during the war. Museums and veteran associations realized they were holding pieces of personal history that had survived against all odds. Each envelope, each photo, each notebook held clues about a life that had ended far from home. In some cases, the documents provided information about battles, movements, and daily routines that rarely appeared in official reports. Archivists began preserving them in climate-controlled rooms, cataloging their contents meticulously. They understood that these papers were more than artifacts, they were emotional time capsules. When historians spoke with American veterans who had carried the letters for decades, they noticed something striking. Many veterans had kept them safe with unusual care. Even in storage boxes filled with medals or faded uniforms, the letters were often wrapped separately, protected from dust and moisture. It was as if both sides, even in silence, recognized their significance. This recognition formed the foundation for later efforts to return the letters to the families who had waited so long. Cultural barriers formed one of the most difficult obstacles in the effort to return wartime letters. In Japan, grief was often expressed quietly, tucked beneath layers of duty, pride, and social expectation. Many families believed that speaking too openly about their fallen sons might seem like dwelling on shame, especially in the years after defeat when the country sought to rebuild its identity. Some widows remarried and felt uncertain about revisiting a past that had already reshaped their lives once. Others feared the emotional weight of receiving a letter decades too late, words written by a young man who never knew his own fate. On the American side, veterans carried their own hesitations. They questioned how a family might react to receiving an item recovered from a battlefield where their loved one had died. It was difficult to approach a culture they did not fully understand, especially when old wounds between the nations were still healing. These intersecting emotions, Japanese silence, American uncertainty, created a quiet barrier that lasted for years, slowing efforts even as the desire for closure grew stronger. Diplomacy eventually became a subtle but powerful force behind the return of personal artifacts. As Japan and the United States forged a close alliance during the Cold War, interest in reconciliation deepened. Government officials rarely publicized the exchanges, but they quietly supported organizations working to reconnect families with their lost belongings. Diplomatic channels help verify names, organize small ceremonies, and coordinate communication between veterans and survivors. In some cases, Japanese newspapers partnered with American institutions, translating letters or publishing calls for information. These collaborations often revealed how deeply both nations valued the symbolic act of returning a soldier's final possessions. It was never grand diplomacy, never a matter of treaties or speeches. It was something quieter, a shared understanding that healing sometimes came in the form of an envelope, a photograph, or a journal carried across the ocean. Through this cooperation, dozens of families were reunited with memories they believed destroyed forever, and each return added another small layer to the fragile trust between the two nations. Yet intertwined with diplomacy and cultural sensitivity was a heavy moral weight that could not be ignored. Returning a letter was not simply an act of kindness. It meant reopening stories long sealed by grief. Some families accepted the items with trembling hands, whispering thanks through tears. Others declined, believing that disturbing the past would cause more pain than comfort. A few were angry, questioning why the belongings had been taken in the first place, even if the intentions had been innocent. For American veterans, offering these letters could stir memories they had spent much of their lives trying to quiet. Battles they had locked away, faces they tried to forget, surged back with surprising clarity. Handing over a letter often meant confronting not only the death of an enemy soldier but the violence they themselves had survived. And yet, despite this emotional weight, veterans and families alike recognized something undeniably human in these exchanges. Each return was a moment where loss, regret, and compassion existed together. It was an acknowledgement that war erased futures but could not fully silence the voices left behind on paper. By the 1970s, the quiet, scattered attempts to return wartime letters began to take a more organized shape. Veterans who had carried the artifacts for decades finally reached an age where confronting the past felt necessary, not optional. Many found themselves sorting through old footlockers, uniforms folded with care, medals dulled with time, and at the bottom, envelopes written in kanji they still could not read. These veterans contacted libraries, museums, and Japanese cultural centers, hoping someone might help them identify the families who had written the words preserved for so long. What began as individual gestures slowly grew into a movement supported by historians, volunteers, and community groups. In Japan, interest in wartime history was rising as younger generations asked questions their parents had long avoided. Newspapers began publishing stories about American veterans returning personal belongings, and these articles created a ripple of hope across the country. Families who had never received any trace of their loved ones wondered if such items might still exist. In some cases, these reports revealed names, photographs, or unit details that allowed researchers to track down surviving relatives. The process was slow and delicate, requiring cross-referenced records, local temple archives, and interviews with aging neighbors who still remembered young men who had gone off to war and never returned. Organizations began forming on both sides of the Pacific, committed to bringing these long-lost letters home. In the United States, veterans associations hosted small ceremonies. In Japan, communities gathered in town halls or shrines to witness the return of belongings believed destroyed decades earlier. These events became deeply emotional moments. Families arrived with mixed feelings: gratitude, sorrow, disbelief. When a letter written by a son or husband was placed into their hands, the room often fell silent. The years dissolved. The voices of the past returned through ink that had somehow survived jungles, gunfire, and time. One of the most poignant scenes unfolded when an American veteran, now in his 70s, traveled to Japan carrying a letter he had kept since the Battle of Saipan. He stood before the soldier's son who had been only an infant when his father died. As he handed the envelope over, his voice trembled. The son opened it slowly, eyes fixed on the handwriting he had never seen before. Tears formed before he could finish the first line. The veteran, overwhelmed, bowed deeply, an instinctive gesture of respect that needed no translation. Moments like these showed that despite the devastation of war, humanity had found a way to emerge through simple acts of remembrance. These individual reunions inspired larger initiatives. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, formal organizations dedicated to repatriating wartime belongings gained momentum. Volunteers digitized old letters, translated diaries, and worked with local historians throughout Japan to trace family lines. Media coverage brought public attention to stories of families finally receiving closure. Each successful return added strength to the movement, encouraging more veterans and descendants in the United States to step forward with items they had kept but never known how to return. Gradually, it became clear that the effort had grown into something far more significant than anyone initially imagined. As the movement expanded, so did the emotional impact. American veterans often described the returns as lifting a burden they had carried quietly for most of their lives. Japanese families spoke of the relief and pain intertwined in receiving a letter written in a moment when their loved ones still believed in the possibility of returning home. With every return, the distance between former enemies seemed to shrink. The act did not erase the past, but it illuminated a part of it that had long been overshadowed, proof that even in the darkest moments of war, the simple words of a soldier trying to reach his family still held the power to bridge generations. The growing scale of these returns led naturally to the next phase, when the movement expanded into a coordinated, internationally recognized effort that would reunite hundreds of families with letters they thought lost forever. As the new century began, the repatriation of Japanese wartime letters transformed from isolated stories into a coordinated global effort. Technology played an unexpected role. Old documents, once nearly impossible to match with surviving families, could now be scanned, uploaded, and analyzed by volunteers around the world. Databases of wartime records became searchable. Genealogy groups stepped in, linking names in fatting ink with census documents, temple registries, and local archives. Suddenly, a letter abandoned on an island in 1944 could be traced to a small village in rural Japan with remarkable accuracy. American veterans, many now in their 80s, felt a new urgency. Time was catching up with them. They worried that if they passed away without returning the items, the chance for families to receive closure might vanish once more. Some wrote to historical societies describing envelopes they had held onto for a lifetime. Others contacted Japanese consulates, hoping their stories might help identify the intended recipients. Veterans who had kept quiet for decades finally spoke openly about the weight these letters carried, their beauty, their sadness, and the memories they stirred. Meanwhile, in Japan, the public response grew stronger. Television documentaries followed the path of returned items, showing families reacting with disbelief and gratitude. Newspapers published stories about aging mothers and fathers still alive to see a final message from sons lost more than half a century earlier. Viewers who read these accounts began contacting the organizations, asking if their own loved ones might have had belongings recovered during the war. Many had lived for decades with unanswered questions, filling the gaps with imagination and pain. Now, they hoped that even a small scrap of paper might reveal something about the last days of a husband, a brother, or a father. The returns themselves became profoundly emotional events. Some took place in quiet homes with only a translator and a historian present. Others occurred in community halls or shrines where townspeople gathered in respectful silence. Families often opened the letters with trembling hands. Some read them aloud, others could not speak at all. A simple greeting, "I hope this letter finds you well," struck with the force of a lifetime. For many, it was the first time they had heard their loved one's voice in words since the day he left for war. Yet not every return brought comfort. Some families refused the items, fearing that reopening old wounds might cause more sorrow. A few held complicated feelings about the war and preferred to let the past remain undisturbed. Others felt deep gratitude toward the American veterans who had kept the letters safe for so long, understanding that these men, once enemies, had preserved something precious. There were moments when both sides wept together, overwhelmed by the shared weight of memory. Veterans often expressed relief, saying that the letters had never truly belonged to them, only to the families who finally received them. In some cases, the letters revealed details long buried by time. Sons discovered the final words of fathers they never met. Widows learned that their husbands had thought of them even in their darkest days. Entire families, scattered across generations, gathered to hear the writing of a young man who had been gone since the mid-1940s. These readings became a bridge between past and present, reminding everyone that behind every statistic of war was a human being with hopes, fears, and love. One particularly powerful moment occurred when the descendants of a Japanese soldier met the children of the American Marine who had carried their father's belongings home. The Marine had passed away, but his children honored his final request, to return the letters if it ever became possible. When the envelope was opened, the Japanese family bowed deeply. The son of the Marine bowed back. There were no speeches prepared, no grand gestures, just a shared understanding that history had brought them together in a moment neither side could have imagined during the war. By the 2010s, the repatriation movement had grown into an internationally recognized humanitarian effort. Volunteers from both nations worked tirelessly to identify names, translate documents, and locate relatives scattered across Japan's towns and cities. Some families received multiple items: a diary, a photograph, a final message written in pencil. Others received only a single sheet of paper, but even that was enough to reshape how they remembered their loved ones. As the last surviving veterans continued to come forward, the pace of returns increased. Each item carried a story of survival through jungle humidity, battles, storms, trans-Pacific voyages, and decades of storage. And every time a letter was placed into the hands of its rightful family, it felt as though a small part of the past had finally been set right. These returns, built on compassion, persistence, and a willingness to confront painful memories, marked the true turning point in a journey that had begun in the ashes of war. What followed was the long, quiet impact these reunions had on both nations, reshaping how the war was remembered and how its wounds slowly began to heal. As more letters found their way back to Japan, the impact rippled far beyond the individual families who received them. In many communities, these returns reopened conversations that had been silent for generations. People who rarely spoke about the war began sharing memories, brothers recalling the day their sibling left for the front, daughters describing the moment a telegram arrived announcing a father's death, elders reflecting on the years they spent wondering how their loved ones had lived and how they had died. The returned letters became catalysts for understanding a past that many families had learned to carry quietly. In Japanese households, these artifacts often took their place on family altars, nestled alongside photographs, incense, and wooden memorial tablets. For some families, the letters provided their first real sense of closure. Instead of imagining an abrupt, lonely death on a distant island, they could now hear the soldier's own voice, gentle, hopeful, and full of life. A simple sentence about the weather or a mention of a sibling's wedding brought back the person they remembered before the war replaced everything with uncertainty. The letters reminded them that their loved ones had remained human until the very end. They were not just names etched on cenotaphs or listed in military records. They were sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers thinking about home. For American veterans, the emotional aftermath was equally profound. Many had carried heavy memories for most of their lives, rarely discussing the war except with those who had served beside them. The letters, diaries, and photographs they once picked up on battlefields had never felt like trophies. Instead, they became reminders of the human cost of the conflict and symbols of unresolved responsibility. Returning these items, sometimes after 50 or 60 years, allowed these veterans to finally let go of a burden that had followed them through marriage, parenthood, and old age. Many said the act brought them a peace they never expected. For some, it was the first time they cried for the enemy soldiers they had fought against, recognizing in their final words the same fears and longings they themselves had carried into battle. The broader relationship between the United States and Japan also shifted subtly as these stories reached the public. Media coverage on both sides emphasized not the violence of war but the humanity uncovered in its aftermath. Viewers saw Americans and Japanese, who once faced each other across beaches and trenches, standing together in quiet ceremonies, hands shaking, heads bowed. The returns became small but meaningful acts of reconciliation, gestures that spoke louder than any political statement. They reminded younger generations that peace between nations is not built only through treaties and alliances, but also through acknowledging the lives touched and broken by war. Historians observed that the letters also filled significant gaps in the record of the Pacific conflict. Many Japanese units had been lost entirely, with few survivors left to tell their stories. Personal writings found on battlefields revealed the daily realities of soldiers stationed on isolated islands, ration shortages, disease, morale, and the mental strain of facing overwhelming American firepower. These documents became invaluable for researchers seeking to understand the war from a human perspective rather than solely through official reports. Museums in both countries began featuring the letters in exhibitions, presenting them not as relics of an enemy nation but as universal symbols of longing, fear, and family. What emerged from all of this was a shared recognition that these handwritten pages had bridged a silence that had endured since the mid-1940s. Instead of fading into the shadows of history, they became threads connecting two nations whose destinies had once collided violently. The returns did not erase the suffering or the devastation of the war, but they allowed people to acknowledge it with honesty, compassion, and a sense of shared humanity. The emotional journey was far from over, however. The returns sparked new questions about memory, legacy, and the responsibility to preserve the voices of those lost to war. These questions shaped the next stage of the aftermath, as both nations began exploring how these rediscovered letters would influence the way future generations learned about the conflict and understood its human cost. As the movement gained momentum, the significance of these letters extended far beyond the families who received them. They began influencing how future generations in both Japan and the United States understood the Pacific War, a conflict often portrayed through battles, strategy, and political decisions rather than the intimate human experiences hidden within personal belongings. Schools, museums, and historians incorporated the returned artifacts into lessons and exhibits, emphasizing the individual lives behind large-scale historical events. These letters revealed the emotional landscapes of ordinary soldiers, their exhaustion, their fears, their longing for home, and their attempts to stay hopeful despite the growing certainty that survival was slipping away. Organizations dedicated to repatriating wartime items expanded their reach. Volunteers in the United States, many of whom had no direct connection to the war, spent hours scanning documents, researching names, and collaborating with Japanese communities to track down descendants. In Japan, local historians and temple caretakers often played vital roles in identifying families still living in ancestral towns. The process was painstaking, sometimes taking years to match a single letter with its rightful home. Yet the dedication on both sides reflected a shared belief that even one successful return held deep meaning. Each completed journey strengthened the idea that humanity could persist even in the aftermath of immense destruction. The letters also prompted broader reflection on the consequences of war. Many Americans who witnessed the returns spoke about understanding their former enemies in a way they never had before. The writings of Japanese soldiers revealed common threads of human concern: The desire to see a child grow, the hope of returning to work on the family farm, the simple wish to survive long enough to embrace loved ones again. These sentiments resonated with American veterans who had written similar letters from their own trenches and foxholes. The realization that both sides were filled with young men fighting for the same basic hopes created a deeper awareness of the shared cost of conflict. In Japan, the returns often reshaped family narratives. Younger generations who had grown up hearing little about the war suddenly found themselves holding a piece of their heritage, something that made the distant stories real. A letter written in neat handwriting, a diary entry describing hunger and exhaustion, a photograph folded carefully into a breast pocket. These items connected grandchildren and great-grandchildren to ancestors they had never known. Many families held small gatherings, placing the returned belongings on altars while offering incense and prayers. For some, it was the first opportunity to honor a relative whose memory had been clouded by decades of uncertainty. As the years passed, the repatriation movement became part of a larger global trend, nations confronting the personal toll of their wartime pasts by recovering and returning lost artifacts. Similar efforts emerged in Europe, where items from the Eastern Front and Western Front were returned to families across borders. These movements reflected a growing belief that the smallest belongings, a letter, a photograph, a notebook, carried immense power to heal wounds left by decades of silence. They allowed people to remember that behind every uniform was a human being whose life mattered. By the 2020s, many of the surviving veterans who had carried Japanese letters had passed away. Their children and grandchildren, honoring their wishes, continued the process. Items discovered in closets and attics were sent to organizations dedicated to finding the families of the fallen. Even as the eyewitnesses to the war faded, the letters continued to travel home, carried forward by new generations committed to preserving the fragile threads of memory. The impact of these returns echoed long after the envelopes were opened. They reshaped how history was taught, how families understood their past, and how two former enemies viewed each other. The letters became symbols of reconciliation, not through grand gestures but through humble acts of respect that crossed oceans and decades. They reminded both nations that even in the darkest chapters of human history, compassion could find a way to survive. And as more families received the final words of loved ones they had lost long ago, the world was quietly reminded that the legacy of war is not only destruction. It is also the enduring desire to reclaim the voices that conflict tried to silence, and to honor them by ensuring they are never forgotten. Now, with the consequences fully drawn, only one final step remains: to reflect on what this extraordinary journey of lost and returned letters truly means for memory, humanity, and the generations who inherited the echoes of a war they did not fight. The story of the returned letters ultimately reveals something deeper than the history of a single war. It shows how, across time, people search for meaning in the fragments left behind by those who never came home. These small pieces of paper, creased, sun-faded, sometimes nearly illegible, carry a weight that statistics and battle maps can never express. They show the human cost in its purest form: a father missing his child's first steps, a brother hopping to see spring again, a young man trying to reassure worried parents while knowing he may not survive another week. When these words finally reached the families for whom they were written, they closed wounds that had remained open for generations. The journey of these letters also demonstrates how reconciliation often begins not with governments but with individuals. A Marine pulling a pouch from the mud, a historian opening a forgotten box, a volunteer spending hours searching for a name typed in a different alphabet. These quiet acts of respect formed bridges where once there had only been devastation. They proved that even long after peace treaties are signed, healing is a process carried forward by ordinary people who refuse to let history remain incomplete. For the families who received the letters, the returns did more than provide answers. They restored a sense of dignity to lives overshadowed by loss. They offered a chance to honor the fallen not as faceless soldiers, but as sons, husbands, and brothers whose final thoughts had finally reached home. And for the world, these returns served as a reminder that war does not end when the fighting stops. Its consequences ripple across decades, carried in memories, silences, and the things left behind. In the end, the letters stand as a testament to the enduring connection between the living and the dead. They show that even in the aftermath of immense conflict, compassion can travel the same distance as violence once did. And they remind us that humanity is preserved not only in victory or defeat, but in the choice to remember the smallest, most fragile traces of those who were lost.